For many of you, our next guest is a very familiar face. She is a esteemed graduate of our college and Nebraska native as well, and it's always great to have Jenn Johnson come back and share her experiences as a reporter for the Washington Post, which is what she will be spending a good part of the next hour talking about. The title of this conversation with Jenn is Covering President Trump. Should we say timely? Jenn is the White House correspondent for the Washington Post. She also writes about the political movement that swept President Trump into office. She covered Trump's campaign for more than a year, traveling to more than 170 rallies and interviewing hundreds of Trump supporters. Jenn has worked at the Post for nearly 10 years. She previously covered Maryland politics and higher education. And as I mentioned, she grew up in Omaha, and she is a graduate from the College of Journalism and Mass Communications here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So, Jenn, great to have you back, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Well, it is so good to be home. I used to take classes in this room, and so it's a little different to be standing on the stage this time. But it's been so wonderful to be back on campus, to see professors of mine who've continued to be mentors over the years. I also have in the audience today Marcia Kalkowski, who was my high school journalism teacher in Omaha, at Omaha Marion. And also Dan Chatil, who's the general manager at the Daily Nebraskan, where I worked for 4 years. So good to be home. Excited to see my parents this weekend, having dinner with my college roommate tonight. So any chance to get back into the Cornhusker State is always wonderful. An escape from the swamp, as we now call Washington, D.C. And I would have to also add that I wouldn't be where I am today if it were not for the College of Journalism and Mass Communications. Not just what I learned in my classes, which has stuck with me over all of these years, but also just conversations that I had with professors in their offices, traveling to Sri Lanka with Joe Starita to report on the aftermath of a tsunami, working at the Daily Nebraskan, and also just talking to my classmates. I have classmates who grew up on farms or in the military or on reservations, several friends who were the first in their family to go to college. And all of these experiences that I had here at Lincoln have really made me the person and the reporter that I am today. But let's talk about President Trump. I know that's what you guys all want to hear about. And I'm going to flash back a little bit to May 2015. I had just joined the Washington Post national staff to cover the campaign, and they assigned me to cover Scott Walker, the Wisconsin governor who eats ham sandwiches and rides a Harley and busted up the unions and was really kind of a darling of the conservative movement and a big favorite of GOP donors. And we thought he had a real chance of making it through the primaries. And I went to what we call a cattle call. It was a conference that was held in South Carolina for conservatives. And all of the potential candidates for president would come and speak to an audience of conservatives, kind of give them an early preview of what to expect during the election. And when people like Scott Walker or Jeb Bush were on stage, the balcony was filled with reporters who watched their every word. And when those candidates left the stage, a lot of reporters left the balcony to go out to the lobby to try to chase down campaign managers and aides and candidates and things like that. And I happened to stay in the balcony as Donald Trump came on stage. And at that point, May 2015, he was considered a joke. A lot of people didn't even know if he was going to run or not. And he gave this speech that kind of stunned me because it wasn't your traditional political speech at all. And I actually ended up writing a blog post about his speech, and I approached it from the angle of if Donald Trump had talking points for this speech, which I don't think he did, here's what they would have been. And it's really amazing how, I mean, this was from 22 months ago, how these talking points have really stayed through. It was a quick post, so I'm just going to rattle it off to you guys. All right, take the stage. Tell a heckler you're fired. Bash politicians. Accuse Scott Walker of stealing your theme, Make America Great Again. Then accuse Mike Huckabee of stealing your platforms. Talk about how much money you have. Mention working in China with the Chinese. Call President Obama incompetent. Promise to be the greatest jobs president ever. Oh, and great at national security. Shout out to the wounded warriors and to General George Patton. Call political reporters dishonest. Remind people that you might actually run for president. Share that your net worth is $10 billion. Plug the TV show. Go back to talking about China. Oh, and don't forget about Japan and all of its cars. We should tax that. Remind people that you own planes like they own cars. Plug the Trump brand. Debate aloud if it's racist to use a Chinese accent when talking about the Chinese. Okay, on to Iran. But first you have to plug your book. You know, you could totally negotiate the release of hostages in Iran. Is global warming really a real thing? Remember all that snow in Boston? Plug your environmental awards. Go back to talking about hostage negotiations. Call Sergeant Bo Bergdahl a piece of garbage. Shout out to the Duck Dynasty. Hey, Walker, don't steal other people's themes. You have so much money. Okay, on to Mexico and their exported cars. We should tax that. Say that you don't give an expletive about lobbyists. Wait for the applause to die down from that. Share your thoughts about the ridiculousness of super PACs. You don't need a super PAC because you have so much money. Remind people again that you might actually run for president. And why don't those sleaze bag reporters like you? Let's turn this country around, tax China, more jobs. One more thing, let's build a massive wall along the border and make Mexico pay for it. And then thank the crowd, exit to the sound of, you all ready for this? And I sat there just kind of like, what just happened? And the crowd loved it. They had been mostly asleep through most of the other speeches, kind of applauding at the red meat lines, and you know, but not really. And this jolted them. At that point, I thought that they were laughing at the spectacle of it all. I didn't think he actually had a chance. I didn't actually think that people in this audience were going to actually vote for him. So we keep going. Donald Trump announces that he's going to run for president. He gives an announcement speech, very much like that one that he gave in May. I'm still covering Scott Walker. And in September 2015, the editors decided we needed to switch up our staffing. Walker had completely plummeted in the polls, and we didn't have anyone full-time on Trump. We would have reporters grab his rallies here or there, but we didn't have one person documenting all of the things that he was saying. And at this point, he had been #1 in the polls for months. He was the front runner. We needed someone to cover him. And so I switched over to Trump. Soon after I did that, Scott Walker dropped out after a campaign that lasted 70 days. And all of a sudden, I was the Trump reporter. And this beat could not have been any different from the Walker beat. And the press corps was much smaller than it had been on Walker. Each of the TV networks had an in-bed, which is like a 20-something who just finished college and follows the candidate around with a camera, recording every little thing that they say. So each network had an in-bed. A lot of the networks would regularly send their correspondents to rallies, like Katie Tur from NBC, Sarah Murray from CNN. And then it was me, and it was an AP reporter, Jill Colvin, and that was basically it. Like, we very rarely, for months, saw reporters from the Wall Street Journal, from the New York Times, from Reuters, from Bloomberg, from Politico, even though when I had been covering Walker, who was way down in the polls, they were always at his events. And part of that reason, I mean, one is a lot of people expected him to fade out, and they felt like it was important to still be covering candidates like Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz. But the other thing is, Donald Trump was very easy to cover sitting at your desk. All of his rallies were broadcast online. So you could sit in New York or DC, pull up the feed, watch the speech. And to be honest, if you're just doing that, it was hard to take him seriously because a lot of his speeches were like the one I saw in South Carolina. It was hard to pick a headline because there were so many headlines. And the things he was saying didn't really seem like things that a president could do or that would resonate with voters. But the thing is, the real story of Donald Trump was in the audiences that would show up to these rallies. And over the course of covering him, I went to more than 170 of them in 35 states and just talked to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of supporters and wrote dozens of stories about why they were there and what they liked about him. One of the first Trump rallies that I went to was at the Oklahoma State Fair. And it was the ultimate Trump rally. There were thousands of people there. Before he took the stage, there was this whole lineup of rally speakers. There was a live bald eagle on stage. There was a member of Duck Dynasty in the audience. Elvis was there. There was a fiddler. There was a young woman singing pop songs. Everyone was dancing. And then there was Donald Trump. And he got up there and very soon after taking the stage, started yelling at the media, telling them to pan his audience, to show the crowd, to be honest. And, reporters didn't really know how to respond to this. Networks often show crowds at rallies, often do interviews with people who are in the audience. And as I was sitting here kind of watching this, there was this woman near the fence who was yelling, "Be nice, be nice." And it was just this moment where you kind of take a step back and think, where the hell am I? What is going on? We were being booed, and they were cheering the candidate. And Trump continued on and attacked his opponents, went after Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush and the Secretary of State, made fun of Secretary of State John Kerry for being in a bicycle race, even though he never was in a bicycle race. And it was crazy, but the crowd loved it. And I kept thinking, well, they're just here for the spectacle of it. This is entertaining. They're just here to see that. And I went around, and everyone I talked to wanted Donald Trump to be president. There was this retired social studies teacher in his 60s. And he was like, at first I listened to Trump because I thought he was a joke, but then I really listened to Trump, and what he's saying is actually kind of what I want. So I'm going to vote for him. I talked to this woman who came 2.5 hours from a small oil town, and she was actually standing there with a stuffed bald eagle under her arm that she had won at the fair, because details like that just pop up at Trump rallies. And she told me about how her small town had just been demolished, that the oil rigs are not running at the same rates that they used to, that when the oil jobs dry up, all the other jobs dry up, that people leave town, and that she didn't know if Trump was going to change this, but she thought that he probably had the best shot of it. And so I just kept hearing things like that over and over and over again, and taking me all the way up till election night. Rather than being at Trump's party, I was at a bar in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, right outside of Pittsburgh, where a bunch of Trump supporters had gathered to watch the election results. And as the night went on, they realized he had won. And it was almost closing time. There was a guy who had been laid off. There was another guy who was having a beer with his ex-wife. There were a lot of people who voted for Democrats in previous elections but voted for Trump this time around. And they were kind of trying to wrap their minds around what had just happened. And the guy who's unemployed was sitting there at the bar. He's like, you know what? I'm going to stop drinking. I'm going to lose some weight. I'm going to and it was just this moment where if Trump could become president, anything could change for him. And it was really it was a very genuine moment. And I think that we cannot forget that there was a political movement in this country that swept Donald Trump into office. There are a lot of people out there who are very frustrated with the status quo, with the way things are, with politicians. They wanted something different. They picked Trump. And part of my job now as a White House reporter is not just to report on the White House, but to still get out into the country and hear what people think of what he's doing in the White House. I think that's something that the media needs to be doing a lot more of going forward. So I'm not sure I have to say this, but I'll go ahead and say it out loud. Covering Trump is not like anything I've ever done before. He is unlike any politician or president we have ever seen. And I'm still trying to figure out how in the world to cover him. Each and every day, my editors and I are having conversations about, are we doing this right? And we just kind of keep changing our, each day, trying to take it as a new day, approaching things new. And this president is very, very different than a lot of presidents. And a lot of that has been highlighted by speakers before me. But this is a president who, A, works around the clock. Saturdays are no longer a sacred thing for reporters. Saturdays are sometimes our biggest news days now. But this is also a president who talks in stories, not in facts. This is a president who doesn't hesitate to impersonate a Chinese businessman or a female newscaster or a New York Times reporter with a disability. This is a president who claims to have seen thousands of Muslims in New Jersey cheer the fall of the Twin Towers, who has painted Mexican immigrants as being mostly rapists and criminals, who sat on an Access Hollywood bus and bragged about grabbing women. This is a president who has cast nearly all African Americans as living in impoverished neighborhoods that are worse than war zones. This is a president who has warned that Syrian refugees fleeing violence in their homeland could be a secret terrorist army, a Trojan horse. This is a president who will repeat what he saw on Fox News, or what he thought he saw on Fox News, or what he heard from a known conspiracy theorist, seeming to treat that information as having the same weight as an intelligence briefing. This is a president who has not followed the tradition of releasing his tax returns, who has not answered questions about connections between his campaign staff and Russia, and who continues to be invested in a family business that's moving ahead with projects overseas. This is a president who will take numerous stances on one issue, and when you ask his staff for clarity, you don't always get it. Sometimes because I think they don't really know where he stands on an issue. And this is a president who has cast the media as the enemy of the people. And we saw that firsthand last summer when he banned the Washington Post for covering his campaign rallies for 3 months. And in the minutes after he posted on Facebook that we had been banned, my editor and the political editor and the national editor went into the office and started talking about what happened and why this happened and what's going on. And as we were sitting there talking, Marty Barron shot over a statement for us all to approve before he released it that he had written like this. And he wrote, "Donald Trump's decision to revoke the Washington Post press credentials is nothing less than a repudiation of the role of a free and independent press. When coverage doesn't correspond to what the candidate wants it to be, a news organization is banished. The Post will continue to cover Donald Trump as it has all along, honorably, honestly, accurately, energetically, and unflinchingly. We're proud of our coverage, and we're going to keep at it." And just a side note, how great is it to have an executive editor who has your back like that, who isn't afraid when a candidate comes after a news organization like this? And everyone asks, what was it like when you were banned? It was miserable. Logistically, it was a pain. Rather than flying on the press plane, we would have to book commercial flights and rent a rental car and drive to the event. Rather than just going through the press entrance, we would have to get a general admission ticket online and stand in line in 97-degree heat in Texas one time for hours. I would always give myself at least 2 or 3 hours to wait in line to get into the rally. Couldn't take my laptop in, just took a cell phone in. Also couldn't take in spray on sunscreen or water bottles with a lid, which made it difficult. And I would sit in the stands and watch the rally from there. By that point, we had 3 trail reporters on Trump, and the 3 of us were constantly on the road, just trying to hop, skip around, trying to get to these events. And we would always have one person sit at a laptop or at their desk, watch the rally online, type up a story based on what was going on, and then have the person at the rally file over notes on a cell phone. So we were doing double the manpower that a lot of other places were doing, but it was important to us to have datelines, to still be there, to still be doing it. And quite honestly, it gave me such a window into how disorganized the campaign was. There were times when they would clearly over-ticket events and let people stand in line for hours on end, even though there was no chance that we were going to get in. They weren't walking up and down the line to collect contact information or to encourage people to get involved or to engage them in any way, shape, or form. So in some ways, it gave us a very ground level view of what was going on in this campaign and also what people were saying. I actually didn't have any bad experiences when I was doing this. I was a little worried that people might think that I was a protester or something like that because I'd be the one sitting there not clapping or being part of the group. But for the most part, people I sat with, people I stood in line with, felt like it was such a great opportunity to have a Washington Post reporter who had to listen to them for an hour or 2. And they were very genuine in sharing their concerns, not only about the country, but about what was going on in journalism and about how journalists were approaching their jobs. And I think while there are a lot of threats to the media right now, which the previous speakers have done a wonderful job of explaining, and which I personally am worried about, I think it's also important for us as journalists to take a deep breath and be a little reflective. People do not trust us. People do not think that we are credible. And we need to be doing things to rebuild that trust. And there are some people that we are not going to win over. They feel like unless we are being a cheerleader for the president, then we're not doing our jobs. Or on the flip side of that, if we don't label the president as a liar, even when we don't have any evidence that he knows what he's saying is inaccurate, I actually think there are a lot of inaccurate things the president says that he believes are true. That's lying shows an intent. So on both, we're getting pressure on both sides, and we're trying to stay down the middle, focus on what he says, focus on what he does. But I think it would be good for journalists to listen to some of the criticism. Not all of it's fair, but some of it is fair. And a big critique is that we're not being transparent, that when we have a story that has a lot of unnamed sources in it, people don't know if they can trust us on that or not. And there are some stories, my colleagues have been reporting on ties between people in Trump's orbit and his campaign and Russia. And those are based on sources who feel like they cannot be named, that they will be targeted by the Trump administration for speaking out, but who feel like they have an obligation to warn the country about what's happening. On the other hand, the administration loves to do background briefings. They love to put journalists in a room with an official that we can only label as a senior administration official. We need to be pushing back on that more. We're trying our best. Again, each day is a new battle. There were some great role models on the campaign trail that I think a lot of us should look towards. One is my colleague, Dave Farenthold, who's been a friend of mine ever since I was an intern at the Post. Our desks were close by each other. And he dug into Donald Trump's charitable giving. The president claimed to be this very generous person who had given millions and millions of dollars, and we couldn't really find where those donations went. It wasn't adding up. And this is a difficulty in covering Trump. A lot of times you're trying to prove that there's not something there when he says there's something there. And it's difficult. And so what David did is, instead of just secretly working behind the scenes, was that he tweeted about his reporting. He tweeted and said, here's the list of questions that I just sent to the Trump campaign. I hope that they answer these questions. He would tweet at charities and say, hey, did you ever get money from this? He would say, apparently Trump gave this amount of money to this type of organization. If that was you, can you tell us? Can you raise your hand? Can you let us know? And there were readers who actually got involved, and in a couple of cases would go to organizations and look on their donor walls and try to find Trump's name and send photos. And there was kind of this, the public was able to kind of help crowdsource these stories. And it also just allowed the public in on what we were doing and why we were doing it. Of course, that's not going to work for every story, but it was a great example of how it could be used. My friend Sopan Deb, who was at the CBS News and covering Trump, he's now at the New York Times. On the campaign trail, he would keep transcripts of what Trump said at rallies, and he would tweet out key parts of the transcript, often with highlighting, and say, here's something that the president said at a rally, giving readers raw information, a raw quote, a quote that they could check against a video and make up their own minds about what they thought. Sometimes he would say, here's what he said at this rally, and here's what he said at that rally. Do you think his position changed? I think a lot of times there are a lot of really savvy readers out there who don't trust all sorts of media organizations, who want to go to original sources and check out what you're saying. So we should give them as much raw evidence as we can. That means links to government reports, links to executive orders, graphics that kind of show how this piece of legislation changed into this piece of legislation, videos of interviews, transcripts of interviews, just anything that allows them to double check what you're reporting and decide for themselves if you're being fair or not. But I guess I'll just kind of close by saying, with all of that said, that it's a great time to be a journalist. People are following the news in a way that I haven't seen in years. A couple weeks ago, I drove across the state of Iowa and just stopped along the way and talked to more than 100 Iowans about how they felt the president was doing in his first month. And time after time, I would get someone, and they would say, oh, I don't know if you want to talk to me. I don't really follow politics. I don't really know much. But then they could name the national security advisor, and they could talk to you about the commerce secretary, and they knew Trump's aides by name. That is a level of just awareness that I really haven't seen. There's a lot of people that are following along, who are watching, and it's a great time to be giving them information. And you don't have to be covering the White House as a major newspaper to be doing this work. The president has promised sweeping change, and that change is going to be coming very soon. It's going to be trickling down to states and counties and cities and this university campus. And so journalists in these communities have an opportunity to look at what the president's doing and to tell people if life's getting better, which it could, or if life's getting worse, which it could. And I think it's really important for us to be asking those questions no matter who's in the White House. This is kind of an opportunity for journalists to rediscover the role that we play and the types of stories that we can write. And again, as I think about kind of my own role in the White House and my own approach to the White House, I just keep coming back to this thing that Marty said in that statement, which is that we're going to cover this White House honorably, honestly, accurately, energetically, and unflinchingly. Those words just rattle through my head, and I hope that you guys will embrace those as well. So that's all that I had planned to say. I would love to take some questions and talk about what you guys want to talk about.
Thank you. Seeing that there are no questions, we'll. I don't think that's going to
Okay, good.
Can I ask you, I have a question.
Oh, no. All right.
How many of you have seen the new motto for the Washington Post? Democracy dies in darkness. Can you give us the backstory, please?
Oh, I should be able to. They higher ups at the paper, much higher than I am, had been wanting to find a motto that could kind of guide the thinking behind our reporting. And this is a line from, I believe, a court decision involving a newspaper. And so it's now at the top of our website, the top of our masthead. Even on your mobile app, when you pull it up, it says the Washington Post. It says, "Democracy dies in darkness." And it's a very heavy quote. And I will be fully honest, there's been a little joking around about it in the newsroom. The woman who sits next to me every now and then will whisper, "Democracy dies in darkness." but it's really powerful. And it's really true. Journalists have a role to be the spotlight. Government would love to operate without journalists, without watchdogs, without FOIA requests. They would love to just make decisions and have everyone be cool with it. To have a true democracy, we need to have sunlight. And my parents actually own 2 weekly newspapers in eastern Iowa. And when they bought the first newspaper a few years ago, they were going through the process of getting the loan and things like that. And they were talking to local business leaders who were so eager to have a locally owned weekly newspaper once again, because they had seen the paper kind of struggle to really cover the community, to really ask questions at events, to really explain to readers what it means to have a school bond issue on the ballot and why they may or may not want to vote for that. And it was really kind of encouraging to me to see this small community in Iowa so eager to have a strong newspaper in their community. Now, with that said, they still get a lot of complaining phone calls, and not everyone is always happy. But on their bulletin board, right by their front door, they have all of these thank you notes from people in the community up on the bulletin board. And so whenever I visit, I always make sure to stop by and read those. And it's just a reminder of, at every level of journalism, the job that we need to be doing so that democracy doesn't die in darkness.
Okay.
Yes,
Questions or comments? I will begin with this gentleman over here, and we'll get the ball rolling.
I'm just curious about how good your tweeting literacy is and how that's made a difference in covering President Trump.
Yeah, I am on Twitter. I have, I think, about 80,000 followers, and I will often tweet from events, short videos, photos, quotes from his speech, observations as we're going along, links to other articles that I've done, retweets of what other people there are saying. More than anything for me, it's kind of a digital notebook. I can kind of go back through and be like, oh yeah, that happened. I think with Twitter, you need to be careful. It is a very siloed community. There are a lot of political reporters on Twitter who just kind of talk in an echo chamber to people who kind of think like they do, or people from kind of the East Coast media class. And there are a lot of Trump supporters who the only time that they reach out of their silo is to say something really, really nasty to a reporter or to a Democrat or to a protester or something like that. For me, it's been an invaluable tool because I will have lists of my competition. I can follow what they're tweeting and see what their thoughts are. And I also have a list of Trump supporters and Trump-related organizations, kind of people at the state level. And it's good for me to keep engaged with that and to see what they're talking about. A lot of times there is an issue that will bubble up in that community that I'm not seeing in my other Twitter feeds. And within a few days or weeks, sometimes the president talks about it. And so it's important for us in Twitter to make sure that we're listening to a variety of people. Great.
Sue Bullard.
This is a little bit of a follow-up to the Twitter question, because sometimes, and I do follow a lot of those journalists who are in that echo chamber, sometimes some of the tweets come off pretty snarky when it comes to Trump. How do you walk what I suspect is a very fine line between presenting the truth and not letting your own opinions creep into it, or does that not matter anymore?
No, it does matter. And it's something, I think there are a lot of reporters who consider Twitter to be a different world than, there are things that they'll write on Twitter that they would never write in an article published on their news website. And just like we treat the president's tweets as the same as being a White House press release or a White House statement, our statements as journalists need to be treated the same no matter where they are said. I know for me myself, I've really tried to be careful to not tweet anything that's too snarky or that's unfair. I'm sure that people in this audience or elsewhere could very quickly come up with examples that they think were unfair. But it is also kind of surprising that just by being a Washington Post journalist, a lot of times I can tweet the most basic thing. I will be at a rally, I will tweet a photo of the crowd, and I will say, here is the crowd that showed up for Donald Trump's rally in this place. And all these Trump supporters will say, thank you for supporting Trump. Thank you for being, and I'm like, it's a photo with a location attached. Other times I'll tweet another example I can think of is, I tweeted a photo of a bunch of kids who were in Trump stuff and said, here's some kids who came to this rally. And a couple of people tweeted at me and were like, that's really condescending. You're making fun of them. And I'm like, it is a photo. It is literally a photo with a non-descriptive caption attached. So I think there are definitely examples of times when reporters have crossed the line or have used the wrong tone or have not done it right. But I also think that there's a lot of people that they read your work and they read your tweets through a certain lens, and that it's going to be difficult to change their mind to read your tweets in the voice that you tweeted them in.
Joe Strita.
Jenna, has covering Trump made you a better journalist?
Yes, it has. Yes, it has.
How?
It has made me faster because if you have an idea related to the president, you need to publish that story as quickly as possible because within a day or two, the conversation will have changed and everyone will have moved on to something new. It has also made me really parse things, to really very carefully listen to what he has said or what other people have said, and to push myself on deadline, late at night, working at a folding table in an airplane hangar, to kind of think of the ways in which the holes in the argument, to make sure that I'm giving as much context to readers as quickly as I can. And it's also a big lesson that I've learned from this is that sometimes the most powerful journalism is the simplest journalism, asking a very blunt question. A great example of this is the Jake Tapper of CNN, when Donald Trump had accused a federal judge assigned to one of his civil cases of not being able to hear the case because his parents were born in Mexico. Jake Tapper did this interview where he just hammered Trump over and over again with this question of why he said that and what the thinking was behind that. And asking a question once isn't enough. We need to be really hammering on it more and more. And a lot of times, part of our job is just, describing what we see. Quite often the way you used to cover political rallies is that you would go and there would be a headline, and that was the headline of your story, and that was most of your story, with maybe a couple mentions of some of the other things that came up. But with Trump's rallies, we learned so much about him as a person, as a politician, as a leader, in the way that he talked about things, in the variety of topics that he covered in a single speech. And so a lot of the rally stories that I would write would be just kind of a narrative of everything that he talked about and how he talked about it, with context sprinkled in of how this differs from other things that he said, or when he was wrong, and things like that. So it's made me, I think it's made me a lot stronger, and I also realized that I'm still figuring out how to do this. I think there's still a lot to learn.
Sager has a question for you.
I have kind of a two-part question. Can you take us into the newsroom on election night and kind of what the overall environment was with Washington Post when he was elected? And then also, what would you say to the reports that the media is responsible for the rise of Donald Trump with his free publicity that he received?
Got it. Well, I was not in the newsroom on election night, so I would hate to comment on what it was like because I wasn't there. We had prepared for him for either scenario. We had alternative tops written. We had, my colleague Mark Fisher had pre-written a story that would explain to people why Donald Trump won. And if he lost, it would have been spiked. I think there was a companion story, why Hillary Clinton won, that never saw the light of day. But like newsrooms across the country, polling had said that he wasn't going to win. Or if he won, it would be within like a recount, margin that maybe we wouldn't know that night. I think everyone was surprised, including the Trump campaign, by how much he won. And so, there was, in the bar I was at with all these Trump supporters, they were stunned. They really didn't think it was going to happen. And to the question, there's this ongoing debate that the media created Donald Trump and things like that. And a lot of times in the early days of covering him in September, October of 2015, I would get these messages from people saying, why do you cover what this guy is saying? Why would you do that? And the answer is because he's the front runner, and he has been for months. Why would we ignore the front runner? And I think there also needs to be a distinction made between television broadcast journalism and print journalism. I think the way that we approach things is totally and completely different. But I think there's also a lot of people who think that in asking questions like that, think that the media should play a role in kind of picking which candidates voters should hear about or not hear about. And I actually don't think that's our role. I think it is our role to cover candidates who are running for president. And if there is someone who is a front runner, to tell readers what that person is saying, what issues they're pushing for, to explain why that might not happen, and to let voters make their own decision. We don't get to make up voters' minds. We give them the information to make up their own minds.
University of Wisconsin political science professor Mike Wagner is here this afternoon. Jenna, he has a question just for you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks very much for being here. This is really illuminating and really fantastic. So a lot of our speakers, you included, have talked about President Trump's strategic or happenstance desire to regularly discredit the news media, fake news, or locking you out of the press pen or the press plane. President Trump also regularly uses the news media to legitimize things that he wants to do. So for instance, the claim that President Obama wiretapped him. So he makes this claim, papers like yours say, without evidence, President Trump says this, and then President Trump and his surrogates go on the air and say, well, many people are talking about this. It was in the Times, it was in the Post, this is a big thing. And so how do you, covering the president, or your fellow White House correspondents at the Post and your paper, approach that tension of, on the one hand, he's attacking you, and then he's using your reporting of what he says without evidence as evidence?
Yeah, I mean, this has been an ongoing thing. To your first point, it wasn't when he got into the White House that we became the enemy. We were the enemy all along. And I mean, when I was at my first rally in 2015, the audience was booing the media. He was yelling at us. He was calling us dishonest. And I mean, there were two big rallying points at a lot of Trump's rallies. One was hatred of the news media, and the other was hatred of Hillary Clinton. People really, really did not like her, and they did not trust her. And now that he has won, Clinton is mostly out of the picture, although he sometimes brings her back in as a rallying point. But the media is still here, and we're still in the White House every single day. And so we've really become the target a lot of his anger and frustration and things like that. And he will then, do this thing where discredit us and then say, well, except for these articles, and will often misrepresent what is in those articles in trying to back up his report. And I mean, we've had discussion after discussion about how do you balance covering what the leader of the free world is asserting publicly and everyone else is talking about, and issues that we think should be covered. And at this point, our answer is to just throw as many reporters at it as we can, so we cover what he's saying. And even if it's distracting, the things that he's saying have great gravity to them and serious implications that could come from them. So just because we think it's crazy, or just because we have no evidence that Trump Tower was wiretapped, by ignoring it and not explaining why it may or may not be true, I think we would be doing a disservice to readers. But at the same time, usually we would have 3 or 4 Washington Post reporters covering the White House. We now have 6. And just so that we can cover the day in, day out news while not letting it take us away from the stories we were going to do no matter what he said on Twitter. And that goes across our newsroom. I would say, unlike I saw before, coverage of the Trump administration has kind of become a top priority for our national security team, for our healthcare team, for everyone across the newsroom. So we've been trying to do this thing where we just cover it all, where we cover what he's saying, we cover the investigative stories that we think are important, we cover the policy issues that we think it's important. Do we get the right balance every day? That's a great question. And I think that's a question that we're gonna, again, I can't emphasize enough, each and every day, we're kind of evaluating, are we doing this right? Are we truly being fair? Are we asking the right questions? Are we prioritizing our news coverage in the right way? And I think that's going to continue for a while.
I have a question if he's ever engaged with you personally. I mean, I know he reached out to Jeff Zeleny, one of the graduates here. I spent 24 years in the Variety newsroom in Los Angeles, and he would call us every week when we would run the radio story from The Apprentice, and he would be upset with the words in the headline. He would know if it was in a blue box at the bottom of page 2 or 3, and where should it be. And then you see that in photos of him. He has those copies of Variety in the back. He cared a great deal. I just wondered if he ever engaged you.
Yes, he did. And again, in the early days of covering him, there weren't that many of us. When I actually went to his rally in Oklahoma City, I wrote this kind of narrative take on what the rally was like. him going after the media and the Duck Dynasty guy and the chaos of this rally and all of the different policy positions he was spouting off, and also the voices of the crowd and what people were saying and things like that. And after it ran, I actually got an email from Hope Hicks with an attachment, and you click on the attachment, and it was a printout of the story with his big fancy signature on it and a note of something along the lines of like, "You get it." And I didn't think it was a gushing story or anything like that, but he at that point was eager just to have national reporters covering him. Over the course of the next year, I interviewed him a couple times, often very kind of quickly, backstage before or after a rally. The Washington Post also did a book about Donald Trump. Unlike other candidates for president, there wasn't much that had been written about him from a leadership political standpoint. There were all of his books, and then there were all the books written about his lifestyle and his business and things like that. And so the Post newsroom took on this very ambitious task of, over about 6 months, all of us shipping in together and writing this book that told the story of his family, of his immigrant mother, and growing up, and his businesses, and just really kind of trying to figure out what his mindset is and what he thinks about things. And I contributed to a couple chapters of that book, including the last one, which was kind of a recap of the election so far. And for that, my colleague Dan Balls and I went to Trump Tower and interviewed a bunch of staffers, but also interviewed him. I also was on the plane for like a quick gaggle that he did, and just other assorted things over time. And the thing about Donald Trump when he interacts one-on-one with a reporter compared to when he's standing on stage calling us scum and sleazebags and dishonest and things like that, is he is overwhelmingly friendly and very, Jenna, how are you? It's so good to see you, Jenna. Do you want a bottle of water? Do you want a soda? Do you need a place to sit? Do you need this? It's sometimes hard to get him to actually talk about the interview questions that you want to talk to him about. He's a very big personality. And I hear that from like a lot of lawmakers who've met with him. Even if they hated him or spoke out against him, they'll meet with him and be like, he's such a nice guy. He has this ability to make people feel really good about themselves in this moment, and tries to really focus on just having kind of this back and forth banter instead of actually answering the questions that you want to ask him.
Well, Geyer has a question from the back.
Okay.
First, I want to say how important it is that you are here and giving this talk, especially to the students. I'm now with the college, so I'm not endorsing this, but Maria has pulled together something really wonderful here. And you are so engaging, and I don't mean this as to sound denigrating, but you are real and not ordinary, but you're a real person. And what you're communicating to all the students and the people in the room is, yes, we can do this. This is a possible thing. So I just want to thank you for coming.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you so much. Oh, thanks, guys. Thank you.
I do have an observation that I'd like you to react to.
Sure.
Bill Moyers was talking to Joseph Campbell about what people are looking for in life when they watch TV, when they look at newspapers, when they listen to the radio. And he said, people are looking for meaning. Isn't that the number one thing? Joseph Campbell said, no. He said, what people want the most is the feeling of being alive. Now, that can go to good things and bad things. If you can't get good attention, you get bad attention. Kids know that, and they learn it very early. But somebody actually used this metaphor on NPR the other day. They said Trump is like watching a super movie, The Towering Inferno, and watching Hillary is like watching a documentary on biology. So the newspapers feed that. They need a headline every day. And boy, you have a hard time picking which quote to use, but it's sensationalized and people read it. And I have to confess, I'm a junkie. I can't wait to get to the newspaper in the morning. So Trump has, in my opinion, created a very strong, visceral, emotional reaction, which doesn't have to do with reality. If you watch superheroes and other movies and play those kinds of games, you suspend disbelief. So you're not in a rational realm anymore. You're reacting emotionally. I don't know how you can counter that or how you can manage it, but what are your thoughts on that phenomenon?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting observation. I guess to one of the points that you made in there about all these big headlines about Trump and, nothing, Hillary Clinton was not making headlines like Trump was making. But part of the reason is that her campaign had a strategy to stay out of the headlines. They thought that these headlines would destroy him. To them, it was a good day when the media was talking about comments Trump had made, perhaps against women or things like that, or one of the claims he had made, or one of the faulty facts he had shared, or things like that. So they purposely stayed out of the headlines. They didn't try to make competing headlines with policy ideas, with anything along those lines. It was their strategy to let him play out on his own because they didn't think that people would vote for him. And the thing about Donald Trump that, as I talk with a lot of voters, is that they give him a benefit of the doubt that I have never seen any politician get before. He can, he has made very clear he wants to build a wall on the southern border, and he has taken steps to build a wall on the southern border, and yet there are still people I talk to who are like, well, he's just joking, he's talking, it'll be an invisible wall, it'll be like a technical wall. They hear the things that he says, and they embrace the things that they really like and they want him to do. And for the other things, they're like, well, he says big crazy things. That's just one of the big crazy things that he says. And a lot of times when we were approaching comments that Trump would make, we would use the test. We would be trying to decide how to cover it. And we would kind of use the test of, well, what if Mitt Romney had said this? What if Hillary Clinton said this? Just because Donald Trump is the one saying it doesn't mean that the words don't have meaning. And so that's the approach that we took. But I think there's a lot of voters out there who just, shrugged at it, There were enough things about him that they liked. And a big part of it is just his approach to life. This if you're with me, you're with me, and if you're against me, forget you. He talks about how he likes being greedy, that he's been greedy for himself, and now he's going to be greedy for the American people. And feelings like that really stuck with a lot of voters in a way that I think going forward it's going to be really interesting to see which things they actually expect him to fulfill. And I think bringing down the cost of health insurance is going to be a big one. And which ones they're okay with him just forgetting about.
So feeling Trump's rationality?
What's that?
Feeling Trump's rationality?
Voters feeling it, or, yeah.
Joe Weber has I'm sorry, Professor Joe Weber has a question.
Great.
Thanks very much. Actually, you kind of touched on the subject in your last comments. The media takes his comments very seriously and chases down every falsehood, every inaccuracy, what some call every lie. His voters don't. His supporters clearly don't, and you've talked with a lot of them. How is it that they can rationalize away all of this? That's number one. And number two, is there going to be a tipping point when his promises fall apart and people begin to turn on him?
Yeah. Well, there have been a few cases of, in an interview, a voter will say something that the president has, or that the candidate or the president has said, and I would say, well, actually, and then would kind of fire off some facts about that. And they, a lot of times would be like, oh, okay, and just kind of shrug and go on to the next talking point. There's been this real, there's been a lot of shrugging. There's been a lot of people who are able to kind of shrug off a lot of the things that he says, because there are enough things that he's doing that they're okay with. The Supreme Court seat has been a big one, as we were talking about earlier. Rolling back regulations is a huge one. Cutting taxes, lowering the cost of health insurance. That they're able to shrug off all of these other things that he says and does because they believe in these things very, very much. Politics moves very slowly. The president on the campaign trail signed this contract with the American people that within 100 days of taking office, he would have had proposed all these different pieces of legislation and done all of these different things. And so far, healthcare legislation has been proposed, and the others have not, infrastructure and all of these other things. There are some things he was able to take care of in executive orders, although some of those are now being challenged by the courts. So when does that tipping point come? I think if voters are able to shrug off some of these things that the president has said, I think they're able to give him the benefit of the doubt for several years, But there's going to be a point where he needs to deliver for them. I was in this bar in Coon Rapids, Iowa, and talking with some guys there, and this one guy was saying, how's my life changing? Tell me how my life's changing. That's the only thing I care about. And the weather was on that night, and he was like, now there's news that impacts my life. If it snows tomorrow, I have to do things, And it really stuck with me because I think for a lot of people, he promised them change. And they need to see their lives change in some way, shape, or form. And over time, they're going to grow impatient if that doesn't happen. Or if he's able to deliver for them on one or two things, that could be enough to keep propelling him forward.
This gentleman over here has a question for you. Yes, sir.
In your opinion, when do you suppose the current incumbent will begin to really preside over the nation's business?
The current incumbent. Ask me that again. Wait, when the...
President Trump.
Okay.
When will President Trump really begin to preside?
Oh,
truly preside?
You feel like he's not presiding right now? Well, I mean, he's oh. He has not been in office. I mean, he's been in office for barely 2 months, and he has done a lot. I have been very, very busy covering everything that's happening. And, we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. But I guess I would kind of push back on the idea that he's not doing anything yet, or that he's just the puppet for other people. He made promises on the campaign trail that some people didn't believe. Back in December 2015, he put out a statement calling for what he called a Muslim ban, banning Muslims from coming into the country until we can, quote, figure out what's going on, wink, wink, right? And then, within weeks of taking office, he rolls out a travel ban that bans refugees, that bans people from 6 or 7 countries that happen to be majority Muslim. And so things that he said on the trail are coming true. They're happening.
Sorry, you. Go ahead.
As a professional journalist in a post-Snowden world, when you talk to your peers, are you at all worried about your data integrity working for an organization that the government has deemed not legit? I mean, we've proven they can listen to any phone at any time. How does it affect you as a journalist?
So it is definitely something that we're all aware of, and that we've been aware of for a long time. Whether it's our communications perhaps getting caught up in surveillance of some sort, or getting hacked. The DNC got hacked, and all of their emails were put out for all the world to see. That would be embarrassing for anyone. I've been trying to be very careful about what I put in emails, and to realize that, you know, I shouldn't be writing something in an email to a sensitive source about a sensitive matter if I'm not okay with that email being published out on the internet. And also that, you know, when I'm standing on the stage before an event and chatting about politics, that there could be a hot mic anywhere at any time.
And there was.
But I was on my best behavior, and that's, you know, and you have to be aware. You have to be aware of what you're saying and what you're doing, and that, you know, that unfortunately could be made public at some point. Now, for years, my colleagues on the national security team have jumped through hoops to communicate with very sensitive sources in ways that are much more difficult to trace. You know, everything from, you know, burner cell phones to, you know, we now use, there are special messaging systems that you can use. We've set up a Dropbox for people who have documents or information they feel like would be important for us to have, in an effort to try to allow people to do that anonymously. So it's definitely something. I mean, there was this incident in the White House where at one point Sean Spicer asked people on his staff to put their cell phones in a pile. You know, I mean, there is a real desire in the Trump administration to crack down on leaks. They feel like, you know, leaks of classified information, which they feel like is a threat to national security, just as the Obama administration did. And there are a lot of things that the Obama administration did that will make it easier for the Trump administration to go after leakers. But I think they're also sensitive about leaks coming out about who's talking about who. And so, you know, sources are very careful about what they're saying and how they're saying it, and we're careful about it too.
I'm going to work my way across the room here, and I want to get to him before I get to you, since you've asked a question already, and I'll start with you.
Thank you. Our first speaker tonight talked about human rights and the possibility of having an administration forcing legal action against different newspapers, pushing resources, as well as adding security measures, potentially fingerprinting journalists. Is that something you guys are talking about?
Yeah, I mean, every time one of these things comes up, people much higher than my pay grade are confronting it. And a lot of, so far with Trump, just what I've noticed on the campaign trail and things like that is, back during his business day, he did not hesitate to sue reporters, especially when it came to misreporting his wealth. He felt like reporters would lowball it, and he would sue them, and he would try to destroy them through these lawsuits. On the campaign trail, he threatens a lot. He threatened to sue the New York Times for talking to women who had worked with Trump or who had known Trump and things that they said about him. You know, I mean, there have been a lot of ideas floated around about how to treat the press corps and things like that. You know, part of what we need to be careful about is not giving Trump a headline for something that actions carry greater weight than words. And words should be confronted, but actions are where he actually can be held accountable. And an example of this came up in the White House. Instead of doing a briefing one day, Sean Spicer kind of picked who he wanted to come into his office and did a briefing just with them. Our White House reporter that day was actually unable to be there, so we don't know if we would have been allowed in or not. But a couple newspapers decided when the New York Times wasn't allowed to come in, the Associated Press and Time Magazine decided, well, if they're going to block them, we're not going to go in either. And our colleagues who were in the room transcribed every single word that he said and distributed it. And after that, you saw media organizations coming out with very strongly worded statements and things like that. So, you know, the community is ready to fight for access, to hold him accountable, to use all of the tools that we have to do our jobs. And we'll see what happens. Mm-hmm.
Over here.
Okay.
Okay, so Breitbart was brought up earlier, and I'm just curious how, because that kind of started as like almost a platform for the alt-right, really, and it's kind of emerged now. It's in the White House. How has news organizations like that affected your reporting?
Yeah, it's I read Breitbart every morning, and I regularly check them. You know, I read the Drudge Report. I follow Trump supporters on Twitter, and I click through to their links. I read what they're reading, and you know, so that's the number one thing. I mean, it's just, you know, just like I'm going to the Wall Street Journal's website and the New York Times' website and seeing what's on their homepage, I'm going to these other organizations too, because at this point in history, they speak for a segment of the American people, and I need to be aware of what's being reported there. I mean, the big implication that we've seen is that the president likes to cite these news organizations. The tweets about wiretapping, you know, judging by what we've been told by aides and things like that, seem to be sourced to a conservative talk show host, you know, on a rant and kind of listing all of these different cases and things that have happened, and kind of building his case for, you know, how surveillance could have been happening. And, you know, the president tweeted about that. You know, the president has done an interview with Alex Jones of InfoWars. And some of the things, and for those of you who aren't familiar with him, I mean, he's a 9/11 doubter. And the source of a lot of the big conspiracy theories that are circulating on the web these days. You know, it used to be that we just ignored that dark corner of the world, but it has been brought into, you know, into the spotlight, and it's part of our jobs is to keep up with what's being reported there, and to try to explain to readers why there's no evidence to back up a lot of these things.
Yes, sir.
You came to the Washington Post from the Midwest, from a newspaper's family, and from attending a relatively open admission state university. How does that change your perspective from a lot of the people you work with, if it does?
Yeah, it's, I have a different life experience, you know, and sometimes I'm kind of the token Midwesterner who can kind of chime in on things that I grew up with and things that I know. I introduced the walking taco to the Washington Post newsroom. People had not heard of the walking taco before I got there. But it's important to have diversity in newsrooms. A lot of newsrooms, ours included, are lacking racial diversity. It's something that we've been really, really working on. In addition to that, economic diversity. One of my colleagues who was on the trail with me, his parents are immigrants and worked very blue-collar jobs. And he ended up going to Harvard on scholarships and things like that. And so he gets lumped in with the East Coast elite, even though he has a life experience growing up. He grew up in Alaska. He has a life experience that's so different than my life experience. And we bring that to the newsroom. It's important to have those viewpoints. A lot of the big investment firms and McKinsey and these contracting firms and things like that have actually been on a hiring spree trying to hire more state school graduates and more people from the Midwest and trying to just kind of get some geographic diversity into their teams because it is different. I found that, my parents live in a very small town in Iowa. I grew up in Omaha. I feel like I'm a city kid. I feel like I had a pretty privileged childhood and had the opportunity to go to college. That was never a question if I was going to do that or not. And where was I going with this? And so it just, we all bring our life experiences to it. But a lot of times when I was out on the trail, I would think of questions to ask people that a colleague might not think of. And so it takes diversity, and it's really important for newsrooms of all sorts to have a variety of that.
A fitting question, and I think a fitting answer to end this session with Jenny Johnson, White House correspondent with the Washington Post. Jenna, thank you so much for coming home and joining us.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 10-minute break. We have a panel discussion.